Officer Tyler Grant's arrogance was evident the moment he spotted her on a bustling Los Angeles morning. The scene unfolded on a busy stretch of Wilshire Boulevard near the Civic Center, a street where the modern glass towers of city administration cast long shadows over older, storied buildings. The atmosphere was tense, charged with the whispers of the curious crowd and the hum of everyday life disrupted by an undercurrent of injustice. In the midst of the city's relentless pace walked a tall, dignified black woman in a sharply tailored charcoal suit. Her calm stride and composed expression betrayed no sign of the storm brewing beneath the surface. She was known as Avery Collins, a seasoned analyst for the Department of Homeland Security who, unofficially, had been deeply involved with the United States Protective Services for years. That morning, Avery was simply on her way to work, her mind occupied with routine encrypted messages and threat assessments for high-profile events. Yet, to Officer Grant's jaded eyes, her assured gait and impeccable appearance set off alarm bells of suspicion. Born and raised in a quieter part of Southern California, Tyler had long carried a chip on his shoulder. Since relocating to the city, he struggled to adapt to Los Angeles' diverse and frenetic energy. What thrilled him, however, was the sense of power that emanated from the badge he wore, a badge that, in his mind, granted him superiority over every passerby. That very morning, his inner cynicism seemed to have deepened as he scanned the crowd for anyone who might be out of place. It wasn't long before he noticed Avery. In his narrow view, her confident stride was suspicious, and perhaps a challenge to his authority. Without a moment's hesitation, he tossed aside his lukewarm coffee cup and slid into his sleek cruiser parked at the curb. He followed her at a deliberate, slow pace like a predator stalking its prey along the sunlit sidewalk that wound its way past contemporary art installations and neon-lit cafes. Avery, ever alert, glanced over her shoulder as she noticed the cruiser's relentless crawl. A flicker of concern crossed her eyes, but she did not break her stride. Instead, she maintained her determined pace, her focus fixed ahead as if she were navigating not only the busy street but also a labyrinth of systemic prejudice. Officer Grant's lips curled into a self-satisfied sneer as he finally pulled alongside her. Rolling down his window, he called out in a tone that dripped with forced politeness, "Ma'am, would you mind stepping over here for a moment?" Avery paused briefly, her gaze steady and measured. Without a word, she continued walking. The man's chest tightened at her dismissal, and prideful irritation surged within him. Determined to assert his authority, he activated his cruiser's siren for a brief burst. "Ma'am, I said step over here," he repeated, his voice losing any semblance of courtesy as frustrated honks from behind punctuated the scene. Finally, the woman halted. She exhaled slowly and turned to face him. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked calmly, her tone even yet edged with a hint of restrained annoyance. For a fleeting moment, the world seemed to still as Tyler's eyes roved over her immaculate ensemble, a tailored suit, designer accessories, and the poise of someone who clearly belonged in boardrooms rather than on city streets. His internal monologue screamed that someone so polished must be up to something sinister. With barely concealed suspicion, he stepped out of his cruiser, placing a hand casually on his holster. "May I see some ID?" he demanded, despite the obvious fact that the sidewalk was a public thoroughfare. Avery's response was measured and cool, "This is a public sidewalk. I walk here every day." A tense standoff ensued. For a brief moment, the air was thick with the possibility of escalation, as Avery's unyielding expression conveyed both quiet indignation and a well-honed sense of self-respect. Without flinching, she reached into her designer handbag and slowly withdrew her driver's license, holding it out for him to see. Tyler's eyes narrowed as he inspected the ID. The name Avery Collins meant nothing to him beyond the surface, but her confident silence ignited a spark of personal resentment. In a low, dismissive tone he sneered, "You're acting defiant, there's something off here. Where were you headed?" Avery's response was calm. I'm on my way to work." Her measured tone was the only indication that she had encountered such unwarranted harassment before. Still, Tyler pressed on, his tone laced with both incredulity and entitlement. "I have every right to question someone near a high-security area," he insisted, feigning concern for public safety. "These days, people are plotting all kinds of schemes." Her eyes flickered briefly with irritation, but she maintained her composure. "If that's all, officer, I'd like to continue on my way. I'm late for a meeting." Tyler glared at her as she turned to leave, muttering under his breath so that she could hear, "You people need to remember your place around here." The words cut through the morning air like a knife, a casual epithet born of deep-seated prejudice. Avery's shoulders stiffened. Though she clenched her fist inside her pocket, she refused to engage further. With a graceful, measured step, she resumed her walk, each step resonating with dignity despite the sting of his words. Officer Tyler Grant, emboldened by the encounter yet secretly unsettled by Avery's unwavering demeanor, returned to his cruiser. As he drove off, his hand scribbled her name Avery Collins into a small, worn notepad, as though marking her for future scrutiny. Deep inside, a gnawing discontent churned. He was determined that their paths would cross again, and next time, he vowed, he would not be bested. A few days later, in the bustling offices of the Department of Homeland Security nestled in a secure government complex in downtown Los Angeles, Avery sat at her desk. Officially, she was a dedicated analyst, a role she had fulfilled with quiet excellence for nearly 5 years. Unofficially, however, she had played a crucial role as a liaison with the United States Protective Services, a role that demanded specialized training and entrusted her with sensitive assignments around the nation's top figures. On that fateful morning, as she meticulously reviewed encrypted emails concerning a new threat assessment, the memory of her humiliating encounter with Officer Grant still stung. It was one more in a long line of everyday indignities, but one that cut especially deep. Just as she tried to refocus on her work, a gentle knock at her office door broke her concentration. Her colleague, Marcus Ellis, poked his head in with a soft greeting, "Miss Collins?" he said in a hushed tone, mindful of the classified nature of their work. "Director Reed wants to see you in his office." Avery arched an eyebrow, her heart momentarily skipping a beat. "Did he say why?" she inquired. Marcus merely shrugged with a knowing look, adding, "You better not keep him waiting." With a resigned nod, Avery grabbed her notepad and made her way through a corridor lined with framed photographs of past agents, from the pioneers of protective services to modern-day guardians of national security. The legacy of dedication and sacrifice that those images evoked filled her with a quiet strength as she approached Director Marcus Reed's office. Inside the spacious, modern office, Director Reed, a tall, broad-shouldered man in his early 50s with a gravely serious demeanor, gestured for her to close the door. "Avery," he began, his voice low and measured, "we've received a complaint from the Los Angeles Metropolitan Police Department regarding an incident near the Civic Center." His tone was both concerned and cautious. Avery's pulse quickened as she murmured, "Yes, officer, I encountered an officer who stopped me, questioned my presence near a supposedly restricted area." Director Reed's expression hardened. "The complaint alleges that you were uncooperative and hindered official police business," he said gravely. Avery's jaw tightened as memories of that morning surged back, the dismissive sneer, the degrading comment about remembering your place, and the unyielding prejudice that had marred her morning routine. "That's not true, sir," she replied evenly. "There was no restricted area, it was a public sidewalk. I provided my ID as requested." Director Reed nodded slowly. "I believe you, Collins. But Officer Tyler Grant is insisting on a formal hearing about your conduct. They're treating this as a departmental matter." Avery's eyes widened slightly. "A hearing?" she echoed, the word heavy with implication. Director Reed's tone softened just a fraction as he continued, "I understand your impeccable record. This may be nothing more than a nuisance, but it must be addressed, lest the media spin it into another story of racial profiling in our city. With a resigned sigh, Avery accepted the gravity of the situation. "I'll be there," she said firmly, her voice echoing the resolve of someone who had weathered too many storms to be cowed now. After the meeting, Avery confided in Marcus over a quiet lunch in the department's break room. "It seems like Officer Grant is trying to make an example out of me," she confessed, frustration and anxiety intermingling in her tone. Marcus, ever the supportive colleague, replied with a mixture of anger and concern, "Don't let him get away with it. You have a spotless record, and we all know how these biased stops work. The truth will come out." Avery managed a small, grateful smile. "Thank you, Marcus. I just hope this doesn't spiral into something bigger." Over the next several days, the tension in the department grew. Rumors circulated, some suggested that the incident was racially motivated, others whispered about bureaucratic turf wars between the LAPD and federal agencies. Amid this maelstrom, Avery maintained her professional demeanor, but a simmering anger and a fierce determination to clear her name burned beneath the surface. On the day of the hearing, the sky over Los Angeles was overcast, a bleak backdrop that matched the mood of those gathering outside the historic E. Barrett Prettyman Federal Courthouse. Avery, dressed in a simple yet elegant dark suit with her hair neatly pulled back, paused before the imposing columns that framed the courthouse entrance. A swarm of journalists, social justice advocates, and curious onlookers had already gathered. Banners and signs decried racial injustice and demanded accountability from law enforcement. Although Avery felt a pang at the sight, she recognized some of these faces as fellow citizens who believed in equal justice. She steeled herself and entered the courthouse. Inside, the hearing room was intimate yet imposing. Wood-paneled seats, a polished judge's bench, and a heavy silence set the stage for what would be a dramatic confrontation. Avery's heart pounded as she scanned the room and took in the scene. On one side, a table set for the defense with her legal counsel, Elizabeth Turner, a formidable departmental lawyer known for her incisive cross-examination skills. On the other side, Officer Tyler Grant, flanked by his attorney, Richard Hayes, who wore a smug expression that belied the seriousness of the proceedings. Judge Henry Dawson, a seasoned jurist in his late 60s with a reputation for fairness tempered by a zero-tolerance policy for theatrics, finally entered. At the sound of his measured voice, the courtroom fell silent. "Let us proceed," he commanded, tapping his gavel gently to restore order. The hearing began with Officer Grant recounting his version of the events. His narrative was carefully constructed, a tale of an officer on high alert, witnessing a well-dressed woman roaming near what he claimed was a restricted area. He described how she had refused to comply with his repeated requests to stop, even as he maintained that his actions were necessary to protect public safety. Grant's account was peppered with dramatic pauses and interjections of personal fear for his own safety. Yet, as he spoke, Avery's recollection of the events remained starkly different, a memory of calm composure and lawful conduct. When Elizabeth Turner took the stand for cross-examination, her tone was measured yet forceful. "Officer Grant, you claim that Miss Collins was in a restricted zone. Could you produce any official documentation confirming that this area was indeed off-limits to pedestrians on the morning in question?" she demanded. A palpable tension filled the room as Grant faltered under her questioning. "Well, the area near the Civic Center can be subject to shifting designations at any moment," he stammered, unable to provide any concrete evidence. Elizabeth pressed on, "Then why have we not seen any signed orders or barriers indicating a restricted zone?" Grant's discomfort was evident. He mumbled something about assumptions made in the heat of the moment, his argument crumbling with every question. Elizabeth then turned to Judge Dawson. "Your Honor, I would like to submit into evidence the official street closure orders for that day, which clearly do not list Wilshire Boulevard or the adjacent streets as restricted." The judge accepted the documents, leafing through them with a critical eye. It became increasingly clear that Officer Grant's justification was built on nothing more than his personal bias and a misguided sense of authority. As the hearing progressed, Avery was called to testify. Taking the oath with a steady voice, she recounted the events as she remembered them: the polite yet determined refusal to be harassed, the simple act of handing over her driver's license, and the demeaning remark that had stung her deeply. When questioned about why she did not identify herself as a federal agent at the time, Avery replied, "I had no obligation to reveal my full status, especially since I was off duty. I was simply following my routine and providing the identification requested." A hush fell over the courtroom as Avery's testimony unfolded. Then, in a moment that would irrevocably change the tone of the hearing, Officer Grant sneered, "She's just playing innocent," pulling the race card to cover her defiance. The room tensed, and every eye turned toward Avery. Without missing a beat, she reached into her jacket pocket and produced a sleek, black leather case. With deliberate calm, she opened it to reveal her official United States Protective Services badge. The gold emblem and accompanying credentials gleamed under the courtroom lights, a stark, undeniable testament to her federal employment. The effect was instantaneous and electrifying. A collective gasp swept through the gallery as the significance of the badge sank in. Officer Grant's previously smug expression evaporated into shock and dismay. Avery's voice rang out clear and resolute, "I am no one's pawn. I am here not to incite conflict, but to stand up against false allegations and to demand that justice be served. I will no longer be treated as if my worth is determined by the color of my skin or the assumptions of those in power." The courtroom was filled with murmurs and rustling papers as Judge Dawson's gaze shifted between the stunned officer and the unwavering agent. Officer Grant's attorney attempted to interject, but his words fell flat against the overwhelming evidence of bias. Elizabeth Turner, seizing the moment, turned to the judge. "Your Honor, it is now evident that Officer Grant's primary justification for this stop was not a matter of public safety, but a display of personal prejudice." The judge's eyes narrowed, and he addressed Officer Grant directly, "Do you still maintain that Miss Collins interfered with your lawful duties?" After a long, tense pause, Officer Grant's voice broke. I suppose I did, in a sense, but only because she gave me no reason to believe she was someone who belonged here." His words were trailed by a bitter, disheartened silence. Judge Dawson's stern expression left no room for ambiguity. "It appears that the complaint is without merit. This hearing shall be concluded with the charges dismissed." A moment of relief washed over Avery, but even as the courtroom began to buzz with subdued excitement, she knew that the aftermath of this day would leave ripples far beyond the confines of these walls. Before leaving the stand, Avery addressed the judge directly, "Your Honor, while I do not wish to escalate tensions unnecessarily, I must make it clear that I will take further action if the Metropolitan Police do not address the underlying issues of racial bias in this department." The judge nodded thoughtfully, promising that the matter would not be swept under the rug. With that, the judge banged his gavel, and the hearing was adjourned. Reporters swarmed the exits, microphones thrust forward, and cameras flashed as Avery was gently guided out of the courtroom by Elizabeth Turner. In the midst of the chaos, Avery caught a final, lingering look at Officer Grant, his face contorted in a mixture of anger, humiliation, and something darker, a promise of future retribution. Outside the courthouse, the media had already begun spinning the story into headlines: "Federal agent exposes racist cop in stunning courtroom showdown." The public outcry was palpable, and within hours, news of the hearing spread like wildfire across Los Angeles. Meanwhile, back at the precinct, Officer Tyler Grant's world was unraveling. In the sterile, fluorescent-lit corridors of the LAPD headquarters, whispers of his conduct and the evidence of racial bias began to circulate. His colleagues, once amused by his casual disregard for protocol, now avoided his gaze. The quiet murmur of disapproval followed him as he returned to his desk, where a half-empty coffee cup sat as a silent reminder of his shattered authority. Soon enough, his commanding officer, Lieutenant Alan Walker, summoned him into a cramped office. The atmosphere was tense. Walker's face was a study in disappointment. "Tyler," he said quietly, "explain to me what happened in court today." Tyler slumped into a chair, his earlier bravado evaporated. They dismissed the complaint. "It turns out that Ms. Collins is with the federal agency she showed her badge, and it all fell apart." His voice was low and bitter. Lieutenant Walker's eyes narrowed. "You filed a complaint without verifying the facts, and now the department is facing accusations of racial profiling. We have no choice but to launch an internal investigation." The words hit Tyler like a blow. His heart pounded as he realized that everything he had taken for granted, the authority of his badge, the unquestioned power he wielded, was now under severe scrutiny. Lieutenant Walker's tone softened just enough to suggest that Tyler might salvage a semblance of dignity by owning up to his mistakes. "I expect you to apologize publicly, Tyler. This isn't just about one incident, it's about a pattern of behavior that we can't ignore." Tyler's fists clenched around his coffee cup. "But I was doing my job," he argued, though deep down he knew that his sense of duty had been warped by prejudice. Walker shook his head slowly. "Your actions have consequences. Effective immediately, you're placed on administrative leave. Turn in your badge and sidearm." The finality in Walker's voice left Tyler numb. Reluctantly, he removed his duty belt, letting his sidearm clatter onto the desk with a dull thud, followed by the surrender of his badge, an emblem of authority that now felt more like a chain of disgrace. Tyler left the office with his head hung low, the halls echoing with the silent judgment of his peers. Outside, as a light drizzle began to fall over Los Angeles, he walked slowly, burdened by the knowledge that his career and his reputation were now in tatters. The bitter irony of the situation gnawed at him. The woman he had so despised for daring to assert her dignity had, in the end, stripped him of everything he held dear. In the quiet aftermath of the hearing, Avery Collins struggled to reclaim a sense of normalcy. Though the courtroom victory was a public vindication of her rights, the sting of being targeted because of her skin color and her professionalism lingered. At her modest apartment in a safe Los Angeles neighborhood, she tried to decompress. Lighting a lavender-scented candle and brewing chamomile tea, she attempted to watch a mindless program on TV. But as soon as the local news flashed her face on the screen accompanied by headlines decrying Cop Harris's black federal agent, she couldn't escape the reality of the day's events. Avery knew that she had inadvertently become a symbol, a rallying cry for those who questioned the system's biases. The media buzz, the heated discussions on social media, and the fervor of street protests all pointed to a collective desire for change. Yet, amid all the acclaim, Avery remained resolute. She had only wanted to do her job, to serve her country with integrity, not to become a lightning rod for controversy. Still, the undercurrent of threat persisted. Some days after the hearing, as Avery navigated the city streets, she began to notice subtle signs that she was being followed. A dark sedan would linger a few blocks behind her. Unfamiliar faces appeared in the reflective windows of passing cars. Each incident set her heart racing, forcing her to alter her route, taking a taxi instead of walking, or using the metro to avoid certain streets altogether. Concerned, she confided these incidents to Marcus, who urged her to consider staying with a friend or even requesting additional protective detail. Despite her training and resilience, the persistent feeling of being watched cast a long shadow over her daily routine. Late one evening, as Avery was leaving the secure DHS building after an overtime shift, she felt the weight of solitude in the nearly deserted lobby. With her federal ID hanging around her neck, she stepped into the cool night air, determined to clear her head. The street was dimly lit by the glow of neon signs and street lamps along the busy boulevard. For a brief moment, she paused to savor the stillness before resuming her journey home. Out of the corner of her eye, Avery spotted a dark figure emerging from behind a parked van, a figure that she recognized with a chill running down her spine. The person wore a dark hoodie, and in the low light, nothing could conceal the unmistakable outline of a familiar face. Her heart hammered in her chest as she realized with a shock that it was none other than Officer Tyler Grant. The very man whose prejudice had upended her day was now in close pursuit. Tyler advanced quickly, a cheap pistol glinting in his trembling hand. "Don't you dare make a move," he growled, his voice low and desperate. The threat in his tone was palpable, a twisted echo of the power he once wielded so arrogantly. Avery's training kicked in immediately. She knew that her survival depended on keeping him talking, on stalling until help arrived. "I never asked for any of this," she said softly but firmly, her eyes locked onto his. "I was merely going about my day. You brought this on yourself." Tyler's expression contorted between malice and regret as he advanced. "You could have just told me who you were," he spat bitterly. In that moment, the tension was shattered by the distant sound of approaching sirens and the sudden roar of a car's engine. A security guard Rich, a kindly older man who worked at the DHS building, had spotted the unfolding scene and rushed to intervene. "Put the gun down," Rich shouted, his voice echoing across the empty street. In the ensuing chaos, Avery acted with lightning reflexes. She lunged forward, knocking the pistol from Tyler's grasp as a shot rang out, a deafening crack that reverberated off the nearby buildings. Sparks flew as the bullet ricocheted off a street lamp, and in the tumult that followed, their bodies collided in a desperate struggle. Although Tyler was taller and stronger, Avery's rigorous training gave her the upper hand. With a swift twist of her wrist, she forced his grip on the weapon until it clattered to the pavement. Another move and Tyler cried out in pain, collapsing to his knees. Within moments, security reinforcements and local police arrived, surrounding the scene with flashing blue and red lights. Avery, her own sidearm drawn and steady, kept Tyler pinned as officers took him into custody. "Stay down," she ordered, her voice trembling between relief, fear, and lingering anger. The chaos subsided as Tyler was cuffed and led away in a squad car, his fate sealed by the evidence of his own aggression. In the days that followed, Avery cooperated fully with the investigation. Surveillance footage from outside the DHS building corroborated her account, and Tyler's actions were exposed as a clear instance of excessive force and racial bias. Public sentiment swung decisively in her favor. Headlines blared, "Disgraced Officer Tyler Grant arrested for assault on federal agent, and justice for Avery Collins, a triumph over prejudice." The LAPD swiftly terminated Tyler's employment, and an internal affairs probe uncovered a troubling pattern in his past stops and detentions, an ugly record of targeting black motorists and other minorities. Avery, though vindicated in the eyes of the law, struggled with the lingering weight of the ordeal. Every day, as she resumed her work safeguarding national security and preparing threat assessments, she couldn't help but reflect on how close she had come to losing everything. Even with the accolades pouring in from supporters and civil rights advocates, she longed for the days when she could simply walk to work without the fear of being harassed or followed. Yet, amid the fallout, there was a silver lining. One bright afternoon, Director Reed called Avery into his office once more. This time, his demeanor was warm, his eyes glinting with a rare hint of pride. "Avery," he said, extending his hand, "I've just finished speaking with the deputy director. Your conduct during this ordeal was nothing short of exemplary. You handled every moment with a grace and strength that speaks to your character." Avery felt a swell of emotion as he continued, "We'd like to offer you a promotion to Assistant Special Agent in charge of our new initiative on interagency cooperation. We need leaders who can bridge the gap between our federal services and local law enforcement, and I have no doubt you're the one for the job." Avery's heart leapt with both relief and quiet pride. "Thank you, sir," she replied softly. "I accept." As Director Reed congratulated her, Avery felt, for the first time in weeks, that she might finally be on the path to healing. The promotion was not just a career milestone, it was a powerful statement against the very injustice she had endured. Yet, as the public celebrated her triumph, Avery couldn't shake the nagging thought that Tyler Grant's hatred had not yet been fully vanquished. The officer's bitter words and the sting of his actions haunted her, a reminder that the struggle for justice was far from over. Even as she resumed her duties with renewed vigor, she knew that the fallout from that fateful day would ripple through the corridors of power and that one day, the full measure of accountability would come calling for those who had abused their authority. Back at the now quiet LAPD precinct, Officer Tyler Grant's life had become a living nightmare. The internal affairs investigation, spurred by the media frenzy in mounting evidence, had uncovered a damning pattern in his behavior. His colleagues, once allies in his daily work, now avoided him with a mixture of pity and contempt. The once vaunted badge on his chest had become a symbol of his hubris and the deep-seated prejudice that had tainted his career. After being placed on administrative leave, Tyler found himself isolated in a small, dimly lit apartment on the outskirts of Los Angeles. Each day, he stared blankly at the same scuffed photograph of himself in uniform, a relic of a time when he believed that wearing the badge made him invincible. Now, as he sat in a sparsely furnished living room with a half-empty bottle of bourbon on the coffee table, his mind replayed the events of the courthouse in excruciating detail. Every moment of his confrontation with Avery Collins, every biting remark, and every flash of her federal badge haunted him relentlessly. In a moment of bitter introspection, Tyler wondered where it had all gone so horribly wrong. His memories of simpler times, a childhood filled with hope and pride in the notion of being a good cop, clashed violently with the reality of his current disgrace. The relentless barrage of negative headlines, the barrage of condemnations from colleagues, and the scornful whispers in the precinct had eroded his once firm sense of authority. Even his attorney's words echoed in his mind, "You brought this on yourself." As the days turned into weeks, the internal investigation closed in on Tyler with a crushing inevitability. Whispers of racial profiling, countless overlooked complaints, and dubious stops he'd made in the past began to pile up, each a brick in the wall of evidence that threatened to bring him down entirely. His phone, once a constant companion, now buzzed incessantly with messages from former friends urging him to fight back, but even they knew that the tide of public opinion was against him. The very system he had once revered now seemed determined to expose every misdeed and every instance of bias. One overcast afternoon, as Tyler returned to the precinct for what would be his final day on duty, a palpable silence greeted him. His uniform, once crisp and full of pride, now felt heavy and stained with the metaphorical dirt of his past actions. In a cramped office off the main corridor, Lieutenant Walker and a few senior officers awaited him. The conversation that followed was terse and final. "Tyler," Lieutenant Walker said in a tone that mixed disappointment with resignation, "you're being formally terminated. Internal Affairs has completed their investigation. Your record is a testament to a series of questionable decisions, and we have no choice but to let you go." Tyler's heart sank as he removed his remaining personal items from the locker assigned to him. Each item, a badge clip, a folded uniform insignia, a name tag, seemed to carry the weight of his downfall. As he stepped outside, the drizzle that had earlier seemed almost poetic now felt like a cold, relentless rain washing away the remnants of his former self. The public reaction was swift and unforgiving. Local news channels replayed the story over and over, each segment painting Tyler as a serial abuser of power, a racist cop whose career was now in ruins. Talk radio hosts and online forums buzzed with heated debates, and even those who had once supported him began to distance themselves. The once mighty Officer Tyler Grant had become a pariah, a cautionary tale of how unchecked authority and personal prejudice could destroy a life. In contrast, Avery Collins found herself at the center of both public adulation and private scrutiny. While many hailed her as a beacon of integrity and resilience, the relentless spotlight also brought unwanted attention. Every morning, as she commuted to the DHS building now guarded by an increased security detail, she found herself double-checking her surroundings. The fear of being followed or targeted, even in broad daylight, was a constant companion. Marcus Ellis, her steadfast friend and colleague, urged her to take extra precautions, even suggesting that she temporarily stay with a close friend until the threat subsided. Despite these challenges, Avery continued her work with unwavering dedication. Her promotion to Assistant Special Agent in Charge was not only a professional triumph but also a symbol of the broader movement toward accountability and justice. In meetings with senior officials and interagency committees, she spoke with clarity and conviction, championing reforms designed to bridge the gap between federal agencies and local law enforcement. The initiative was ambitious, a plan to foster cooperation and transparency in a system long plagued by mistrust and systemic bias. Avery's measured approach and deep commitment to fairness earned her both respect and the quiet admiration of her peers. Yet, the shadow of Tyler Grant's unresolved anger lingered. Late one evening, as Avery was finishing up a classified briefing in a nearly empty DHS building, a sense of foreboding crept in. The corridors, usually familiar and secure, seemed to stretch out into uncertainty. Determined to catch a breath of fresh air, she left the building for a brief walk under the starlit sky. The cool night air was a small comfort, but as she walked along a quieter side street adjacent to a vibrant arts district, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Her instincts proved correct and she noticed a dark sedan trailing her at a distance. The vehicle's presence was both out of place and deeply unsettling. Avery tried to quicken her pace, her eyes darting to every shadow and reflection. The sedan kept its distance, yet its persistence was alarming. Eventually, she lost sight of it as she turned into a crowded shopping area, but the image of those darkened headlights and the vague outline of a figure in the driver's seat seared itself into her mind. Avery shared her concerns with Marcus over a late-night coffee break. "I've got a bad feeling," she confided, her voice barely above a whisper. "That sedan, that glimpse, I can't shake the sense that Tyler Grant's not done yet." Marcus frowned, his concern deepening. "You're not just a typical agent now, Avery. You're a headline. I wouldn't be surprised if tabloid reporters or opportunistic criminals are trying to make a play out of your story. But if you feel unsafe, we need to take this seriously." Avery nodded, her determination tempered by the stark reality of her situation. "I'm already on high alert. I've arranged for extra security detail, and I'll vary my routes from now on. But I can't help but worry if he's still out there, it might not be over." Her worst fears were realized one fateful night. Leaving the DHS building after a long shift, Avery encountered a chilling scene. Under the harsh glare of a street lamp, standing just a few paces away, was Tyler Grant. His eyes, once filled with smug certainty, now burned with a mix of rage and despair. In his hand, a cheap pistol trembled visibly. "Don't you dare move," he rasped, his voice laced with bitter resentment and desperation. "You ruined my life. I lost everything because of you." Time seemed to slow as Avery's mind raced through her training. She raised her hands slowly, maintaining eye contact with the dangerous man before her. "Tyler, listen," she said in a calm yet firm tone. "I never asked for any of this. I was just doing my job. You brought this on yourself." His face twisted in a blend of fury and regret. "You could have told me who you were," he spat. "Maybe then none of this would have happened." Before the situation could escalate further, the distant hum of an approaching vehicle alerted them both. Rich, the kindly security guard from earlier, had seen the confrontation and was now sprinting toward them. "Put the gun down," Rich bellowed, his voice resonating with authority. In that split second, Avery lunged forward, her instincts taking over. In the ensuing struggle, the pistol was knocked aside as a shot rang out, a sound that shattered the tense silence of the night. Sparks flew as the bullet ricocheted off a metal lamp post. Their bodies collided in a desperate tussle. Although Tyler was physically imposing, Avery's precise, well-rehearsed moves gave her the advantage. With a swift twist, she disarmed him, the gun skittering across the pavement. Tyler cried out in pain, collapsing to his knees as security reinforcements and local officers converged on the scene. Avery, still holding her sidearm, ordered him to remain down while the authorities took him into custody. "This is your fault," Tyler managed to croak, his voice barely audible as he was cuffed and led away. In the days that followed, the investigation into Tyler Grant's actions gathered overwhelming evidence. Surveillance cameras from outside the DHS building confirmed his aggressive pursuit, and forensic analysis left no doubt about his intent. The legal process moved swiftly, and Tyler was charged with attempted assault with a deadly weapon on a federal agent, along with a host of additional charges related to his past misconduct. The media's coverage was relentless, and public opinion swung irrevocably in favor of Avery's unwavering professionalism and bravery. As the trial against Tyler unfolded in public hearings and press conferences, Avery remained steadfast. Though the ordeal had left scars both visible and hidden, she refused to be defined by the injustice inflicted upon her. Instead, she channeled her energy into reinforcing the new initiatives for interagency cooperation, ensuring that her experience would catalyze lasting change in the system. Public rallies, community forums, and official statements all echoed the sentiment that the abuse of power must be rooted out, and that no one should be made to feel less than human because of the color of their skin or the office they held. Meanwhile, within the walls of the former LAPD precinct, the fallout from Tyler Grant's termination continued to reverberate. Former colleagues whispered about the bad apple who had once represented everything wrong with the system, while others, quietly remorseful, began to question the culture that had allowed such prejudice to fester. The department, facing mounting pressure from both local leaders and civil rights organizations, initiated sweeping reforms aimed at preventing future abuses of authority. Training programs on implicit bias were introduced, and oversight committees were established to ensure transparency and accountability in every interaction between police and the public. Even as Tyler languished in legal limbo, a broken man haunted by the loss of his career and the collapse of his self-image, Avery's story served as a beacon of hope for a city desperate for change. In one poignant moment, as Avery sat alone in her modest apartment after a long day of work, she gazed out at the city skyline. The towering buildings and flickering lights of Los Angeles, symbols of both promise and peril, seemed to whisper that the fight for justice was far from over. "I will continue to stand up for what's right," she murmured to herself, determination burning in her eyes. "Even if it means challenging every system that dares to undermine our humanity." In a final twist of fate, as the legal proceedings against Tyler neared their conclusion, a new headline appeared: "Ex-cop Tyler Grant faces lifelong consequences for abusing his power." The verdict was a stark reminder that no one was above accountability. For Avery Collins, the journey had been fraught with peril and heartache, but it had also ignited a movement, one that promised to transform not just the institutions of law enforcement but the very fabric of society. The story of Avery Collins and Officer Tyler Grant, with all its heartbreak and triumph, became a lasting testament to the enduring power of courage in the face of injustice. It was a reminder that even in the darkest moments, the truth and the courage to stand by it could change the course of history. And though the scars of that day would never fully fade, they would serve as a beacon for future generations, inspiring them to fight for a world where justice is not a privilege for the few but a right for all.